I'd probably have like first. What's up?
Hello and welcome to this episode of Young Guns. We're here with Jonathan Wistersill from Locked On Utes. We are here today to talk with JT about the 2023 Rose Bowl against the Penn State Lady Lions. How you doing, Jonathan?
I'm doing great, guys. Appreciate you having me on. And yeah, this should be a really fun matchup. So I'm really looking forward to it.
So, what's on a scale of 1 to 10? Where would you 10 being the best, 1 being the worst? Where would you rate the 2022 season for the Utah Utes?
Such a weird season, right? Because you lose this massive game against Florida where it's like all the eyes are on you, all the disrespect thrown at the Pac-12. You have a chance going into SEC team, first-year head coach. There's a lot of hype around Anthony Richardson. And look, the first week we made Anthony Richardson look like a Heisman quarterback. Still had a chance to win the game, too. Cam Rising throws an interception on the 1-yard line, basically. So tough way to lose that one. So you go out there, you start the season 0-1. It feels like playoff hopes are really dead, which was the expectation. Then you kind of get right, able to win those games, get a good stretch going, use the tough one at UCLA. UCLA, a very good team this season. But then you beat USC. And it's kind of like, and that was in just one of the most insane games I've ever seen. You talk about the 2-point conversion, the performance by Cam Rising. Dalton Kincaid was incredible in that one. So an unbelievable game there. So then you start to get that hope back up again. And then that Oregon game just leaves a horrible taste in your mouth, where the Utah defense held Oregon to just 3 points in the second half. This is a Utah defense that missed 27 tackles, I believe the number was, in the first game against Florida. So just an incredible turnaround for them. And then the Utah's offense can't get it going. Cam Rising on one of the fourth down plays had one of the worst throws I've ever seen a quarterback make in that situation, where you have a guy wide open. Just like all these different things happened where it was like, this season's going to end in disappointing. And it was disappointing because you didn't control your own destiny into getting the college football play into the Pac-12 championship game. Obviously, the college football playoff was way out the window at that point. And then just absolute insanity happened. It's like, yes, UCLA beat Cal. We thought that would happen. Washington beating Washington State, also a nice up. You thought it would happen, but Apple Cup always a little interesting. And then the Oregon game. I mean, Oregon State, Utah needed that one to go their way in order to get into the Pac-12 championship game. Oregon gets up 31-10. Oregon State says, we're not going to throw the ball. And they win. They come back and win. Just absolute insanity. That gets Utah in the Pac-12 championship game. They obviously go on to win that. I don't know how Utah keeps doing this. Every year I go, it's hard to beat a really good team twice. Well, they beat the crap out of Oregon last year. That was a weird situation with the Mario Cristobal thing, so I thought that was a one-time thing. I honestly thought that I was picking Utah because that's what my heart was telling me. My mind was telling me USC's got this one. They're a motivated, talented team. I mean, they got the dang Heisman quarterback winner on the other side, and his injury did play a huge role in the game, I will admit, too. But what a performance by Utah to get it. So because you are Pac-12 championships and back in the Rose Bowl, I'm going to give them a 9. I think 10 for me, because what the goal was at the start of the season, talking with players inside that program, was to make the college football playoff. But I will say, I think if you win the Rose Bowl, this season bumps up to a 10. Whenever you do something you haven't done as a program, it has to go up to a 10. So if Utah can go in and win the Rose Bowl, the season's still a 10 out of 10 success, because they've reached a new height that back when they entered the Pac-12 in 2011 didn't seem possible at the time.
So and as we're at 12, so what's it like seeing Utah win consecutive conference titles in the Pac-12 after several years of coming up short? And what's it like getting to see Utah make consecutive trips to the granddaddy of them all in the bowl?
It's unbelievable, honestly. The fact that they're in this position now, as we talked about, just didn't. It's always hard when you join a new conference. It's such a big jump, too. But then to see, I mean, Coach Whittingham simply put, one of the best coaches in the sport, the job he's done recruiting, adding talent. But for so long, they just came up short for one reason or another. I remember the Oregon game back in 2019. It was Utah-Oregon in the Pac-12 championship. It was Kayvon Thibodeau's coming out party, but I had like 3.5 sacks in that game. It's just a true freshman, absolutely wrecked the Utes in that one. And it was just like, man, is this team ever going to get over the hump? I mean, if you remember that game, too, Utah wins that game. They're in the college football playoff. They had one loss at that point in the season. And then just to come up so short. And then they got absolutely dominated in the Alamo Bowl by Texas that year, too. So just a weird, like, is this team ever going to be able to get over the hump? And that's what it felt like going back to that Oregon game last year. You get that huge dominant win at home, and then you got to play them again in the Pac-12 championship. And it's like, well, can they do that again? And then they do, and they do it dominant fashion again as well. So it's crazy. And then to also show that it wasn't a fluke, right? To be able to, you brought so much talent back. You were a lot of people's favorite to win it. A lot of people like the USC too, with all the talent they added and brought in. And I mean, for Caleb Williams and Lincoln Riley to live up to the hype, teams like UCLA to take a huge jump, Oregon to be really good in their first year, Oregon State just a thorn on everyone's side. Utah didn't have to play Washington this year. I think they got very lucky in that sense, because that could have been another loss too. When you look at how talented the Huskies are, a potential loss, I should say, that it really is just insane. And you saw the impact it's had on their recruiting too. This is the highest ranked recruiting class that Utah has ever had. And they added, I mean, I think it's four, honestly, it's almost 5 or 6 4-star talents, almost 5 or 6 4-stars committed to Utah after their second Pac-12 championship win. So going back to back, you had guys like a CJ Blocker who decommitted from Utah pre-Pac-12 championship game. How often does a guy decommit and then go, you know what? I made a mistake. I'm going to come back and play for them. Like, that is incredible. So it's had such a huge impact on this program. It's one of the reasons, to me, whatever the future of college football looks like, whether we stay with Power 5, whether it is still the Power 5 conferences, or if we go to a super conference, Utah won't get left out, because now they're back-to-back Pac-12 champions and they have a chance to be in the Rose Bowl. I felt like Utah gained a lot of respect in last year's Rose Bowl when they gave Ohio State everything they could handle. And I know Ohio State was down a couple of their top receivers. I think Jackson Smith and Jigba more than picked up the slack in that one, as Buckeye Mike could attest to for sure. But just being able to play with one of the best teams, I think people are like, okay, I see you, Utah. Then they crapped the bet against Florida. And now you look at them and go, wait, back-to-back Pac-12 champions. And the nice thing about playing the Pac-12 championship game on that Friday night too is all the eyes were on Utah, and they showed out and looked incredible. So it's another great opportunity for them in another Rose Bowl, but it just speaks to where this program is. Since the college football era, they've been kind of a top 10 program consistently. If you look at the rankings of where it ends up in there, 10 to 15, wherever you want to have them, but undoubtedly in the top 15 with it. They've been top 10 in terms of college football rankings appearances. This program has just been really consistent under Kyle Whittingham, and it's exciting that they have a chance to add a Rose Bowl to their trophy case.
So was the expectation going into the season to make the playoffs from the fans? Were the fans expecting playoffs? Or
some weren't, for sure. I think some people looked at it like it's really hard to do it. I looked at it from the simple standpoint of, I was just going through Utah's schedule. Like, I thought they were going to beat Florida, and I think they should have beaten Florida. I think if they play that game any month, like, first of all, if that game's in Utah, like, it's actually going to be next year, and we'll see what that looks like, because Utah might not have the same guys back. I think that game was in Utah. I think Utah absolutely wins that game when you look at the effect that, you know, humidity and some of the things had on that performance too. And just the fact that it was also in week 1, which is a huge thing. It's hard to win on the road anywhere in college football too. So Utah, you know, losing the first game like that, Utah had owned UCLA before this game they played this past year. I mean, they had dominated them the past few years. So just for that performance was tough to see too. And I felt like they would get Oregon in their first year against Dan Lanning. I felt like that was the one where I'm looking at it like early on the season, I thought that would be their one loss, and then they would march on the rest of the way. And as we just saw with all these other teams, you don't leave a one-loss conference champion out of the playoff. Or even if you just go perfect in the regular season, you don't get left out, as we just saw TCU was able to do too. So I think a lot of fans looked at it from that perspective, like it's realistic for this Utah team to just lose one game, be Pac-12 champs again, and then make the college football playoff. And as I mentioned, for a fact, it's what some of those players talked about. It's kind of like when you're in high school football, everyone preaches you want to win a state championship, right? I don't think and if you're in the locker room, you got to buy in and got to believe it, right? It would have been very hard for this team to obviously win a national championship, even in their best mode like that. But if you're talking about making the college football playoff just as an athlete and a competitor, you're going to be like, well, why would we just want to get in? We want to win the whole thing. I'm sure that's what they told themselves at various points in the offseason. So I do feel like a couple of the fans, I said myself included, that was what I thought this team was going to be able to do. So that's where I kind of placed it up there. But I mean, going back to the Rose Bowl feels like a huge success. Anything outside of a Pac-12 championship, I think would have been seen as a little bit of a disappointment. Once you made it back to the Pac-12 championship game, it's like nothing was a failure. Now, I will say, I do think if they didn't make the game, I think this season would have been looked at by a failure by a lot of people. You know, you started the season with your highest ever preseason ranking, come up short in so many big games on the year. But now that you're Pac-12 champs with a chance to win a Rose Bowl, all that goes away. But some of the fans, that was definitely where they had their expectations at, was college football playoff, just because you had this much talent back and it seemed feasible at the time. But now it's what seems feasible is a Rose Bowl, which every single fan will take with this team for sure, and fired up about it.
So as a whole fan base, where do you feel like the expectations lie? Like, is Utah one of the schools that don't really have expectations per se? But like, you know, Ohio State and Alabama, their fan bases are like, okay, one loss is okay as long as it's not to Michigan or Auburn. And we need to make the playoff. We need to get to the national title. We need to win it all. and Michigan's starting to turn that way. Georgia's starting to turn that way. But like, there's a lot of the smaller schools that, like, Oregon State, for example. I kind of gather from their fan base. It's like, we had a lot of success this year. We didn't really have much expectation. I know it's a little different with Utah because Kyle Whittingham has been on staff since 1994, and he's been the head coach since Urban left, and I believe it was 2005 when he left, or 06.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as a whole, did the Utah fans have expectations generally with the football team, or are they just kind of, hey, we made a bowl game, cool, that means we had a great year? It's not like there's not really a step where it's a failure, like how, like, a lot of, other than the awesome guy down in that bottom corner next to you, Jackson, outside of that, man, people are disappointed with Alabama and calling the season a failure. Well, I'll tell you what. If you Alabama lose to Kansas State in the Sugar Bowl, then I would think that would be the big failure of the season. But
no, I get what you're saying as it pertains to Utah. So I think with Utah fans, Kyle Whittingham said the standard is Pac-12 championship. I think if you're in contention for it, I don't think Utah would have been very disappointed to go to the Holiday Bowl or the Alamo Bowl. All those would have felt like a disappointment for this team because of what the expectations were at too. So I feel like as a program now, I think anything, it's tough to say. I think it'll be interesting to see what next year's team, right? Because the expectations were so high because of all the returning talent. So I feel like, I mean, you're obviously they've been bowl eligible every single season. I feel like the standard's Pac-12 championship game. You at least got to make it. It'll be seen as a little disappointing if you don't win it, but obviously it's not realistic to win it every single year. Utah isn't in an Alabama state yet. They won back-to-back, which is very strong. But they're still not in those other positions because they still haven't made a college football playoff. So I feel like making the Pac-12 championship game is kind of where this Utah team is. That's kind of seen as a success. And as I said, maybe that'll move a little bit next year because of all the talent that might leave. But I don't know. I still feel like fans are going to be like, we've won before with defied expectations, made conference championship games. Why can't we do it this year too? So I feel like the expectation is there because, like I said, I just don't. People weren't happy going to the Alamo Bowl because it could have been so much greater for so many years now. What Utah has gotten, it could have been even better. The last 2 years being the exception, obviously, with the Rose Bowl burst being incredible. But so often you've looked at this team and like, man, they've been so close to greatness. So I really feel like, and because they continue to put themselves in that position to have those opportunities of greatness, they've just come up short. This year they came up short of a college football playoff berth, but find themselves in the Rose Bowl, which is obviously, and I mean, as good a consolation prize as you're going to find, I think. And like I said, everyone is fired up about. So I feel like the expectation for Utah fans, I would say, would be Pac-12 championship game. Even if you lose it, I still think you look at it like, hey, you were one of the two best teams in the conference, which is still something to be pleased with.
So we've seen, not to this extent because it was Alabama, it was an SEC school, but we've seen this show before where Utah comes into their bowl game in a New Year's Six bowl strong. It's not, like I said, not comparable record wise, but do you think that this Rose Bowl, I would almost think last year's Rose Bowl too, is similar to 2009 Sugar Bowl when Utah went undefeated in the Mountain West in 2008 and played Bama and beat Bama in the Sugar Bowl?
I think it is very similar to this season because I genuinely do. I mean, I guess you guys might want me to save this for a little later, but I mean, you see all the Utah stuff in the background. You know how I'm going to lean with this game. I do feel like Utah's going to win this game too. So I think it is a huge opportunity for Utah to continue to build their brand. And I feel great about the position they're in. Look, Penn State is a really good team, but I do feel like the Utes have got this momentum just like they had back then. And this will be one of those games you talk about. I mean, we talk so much about last year's Rose Bowl. Even that was a loss for Utah, and the players know that, remember that, and they were not happy with how that one played out too. So I think they are really fired up. I think they got a great opportunity to win this Rose Bowl, and I think they can capitalize it and continue to take their program to new heights. And I think if they win, I mean, if you win a Rose Bowl too, we just talked about what that does for recruiting even more. It's just only continues to put you in a better position. And I feel like this will be another one of those big brand games for Utah if they're able to gut it out and get it done. And what makes this so exciting as compared to last year is a Rose Bowl is an awesome thing. And Ohio State fans are already kind of like, you have so many guys opt out last year, and both Penn State and Utah have guys who have opted out. Funny enough, it's both the team's top pass catcher and then their top defensive back too. Just in the crazy world, it works out that way. But yeah, this is a huge opportunity for Utah to continue to build on their brand. And I got that same kind of feeling as you mentioned too, a big bowl game that you could win. And I feel like this could be another one for Utah. They're one of their most significant wins since that game, as you talked about, as it pertains to a bowl game, because obviously Pac-12 championships are huge, but as it goes for bowl game, Sugar Bowl, and then this Rose Bowl for Utah for sure.
So what do we think looking at the game against Penn State? Like, Penn State's best win is on the road at Purdue. Like, they haven't beaten any like great teams this year. And I mean, they played the Buckeyes close-ish, and then they got smacked by the Wolverines. So what do you guys think going into the game against Penn State? Do you guys think you're clearly the better team? Do most of you fans think that?
Oh, that's a good question, honestly. Do most Utah fans think they're the better team? I would say, yeah. I think most fans think they're the better team. I personally think Utah's a slightly better team, but I think it's close, I'll say. I mean, I'm looking at Sean Clifford on the other side, the program that James Franklin has built. Dang, the offensive line's name is escaping me right now, but they have a dominant tackle who came back for the bowl game for Penn State too. So I really think this Penn State program is in a really good position. I'm really excited to see it. It's just two teams and two programs that really want this. And I think that's what makes it so exciting. As I was talking about before with how Ohio State, like, it was cool for them to win the Rose Bowl. I think they were happy about it. It's the first time they did it, but it felt like a little bit of a disappointment because that standard we were talking about earlier with national championships. So I do feel like this is a big one. I feel like Utah fans, like, kind of perceive us as the favorite, I would say, but it'll be interesting to see what the crowd looks like for Utah. Obviously, a lot shorter of a drive for Utah fans than Penn State fans. So I know some people are going to be making it out there to help the Utes, and the crowd for Utah was it's a Utah home game last year. I mean, the people were making jokes. The whole state of Utah was out there. I mean, there were 60,000 Utah fans there. It felt like, so just really remarkable stuff for the Utes. And yeah, I think this is going to be a fantastic game. I think both teams really want it, but I do feel good saying Utah has a slight edge, and I think fans feel the same way.
So what the victory for Utah to win the Rose Bowl against Penn State?
Say the first part of that one more time.
Yeah. So what are the keys to victory for Utah to beat Penn in the Rose Bowl?
Yeah, I think one thing that they got to do is, and they did a fantastic job of this in the Pac-12 championship game, is just get pressure on the quarterback. I mean, you look at a lot of their losses this season, the UCLA game, how much time DTR had. Caleb Williams shredded them the first time around, but Utah was able to do it with a fantastic offensive performance in the second half. I think if what Utah did against USC was they did a great job bringing a variety of pressures, and they lined up in a variety of fronts too, so you didn't know where it was coming from. You might have an overload blitz to the right. You only have 3 guys coming. You have linebackers blitzing. So I think if you continue to kind of mix up your pressures, this Utah team does not have a dominant pass rusher. So because of that, they got to get a little creative with how they attack them. They have good pass rushers and guys who can get home. Got some big guys on the interior too, who are capable of collapsing the pocket from inside. So I really think one of the keys for Utah is really mixing up their pressures, bringing a variety of stuff and getting after Sean Clifford. I think offensively, I think Cam Rising needs to continue to do his thing. And in order to do that, this Utah team has to have some success running the ball to set up the play action pass, but I really feel good about the position this Utah offense is in. I think they'll be able to do that. I think you got to distribute the ball around. It sucks for this Utah offense that Dalton Kincaid is not going to be out there. I mean, he's been Cam's guy all year, but I'll say this, Dalton Kincaid, the reason he's not playing in the Rose Bowl, he said, is due to an injury. If you watch the last month of the season for him, he got hurt in the Washington State game. Might have even got nicked up in the USC game too. I'm trying to remember now, but he really played hurt the last month of the season. He was just giving it everything he got out there, helped the team get there. And I think now he was looking at a Pac-12 championship game from the standpoint of like, I gutted that one out too. I just don't got it in me for the Rose Bowl, because if he did get hurt there, it would really hurt his draft stock like it did in Matt Corral last year. So I think for this Utah offense, Cam Rising has to do a good job distributing the ball, getting his playmakers involved. I think Utah has to be able to run the ball effectively. They got to get, I think, anywhere in between. They don't need to rush for 150 yards, I feel like, to get a win. But if they're not over 120 rushing yards, and I think something really bad happened for this Utah team. And as I said, really got to get after the quarterback, especially because you're down Clark Phillips. And I know they're down Parker Washington, one of their top receivers too in this one. But I mean, Clark is, with consensus All-American, one of the best defensive backs in the nation, probably a first-round pick, if not an early second-round guy too. So there's other guys back there. This is the top-ranked defense for a reason, right? It's a good secondary, but anytime you're losing your best player, honestly, Utah's without their best player on both sides of the ball, I think it really hurts. So for Utah, like I said, if they can really get after Sean Clifford and really impose their way of offense. I don't know if this Utah team can come back from down 17 or down 14 in back-to-back games. Look, maybe they can. That's not a key to victory though for me, is like, yeah, let's fall behind and then fight their way back basically. So they've proven they can do it too, but like I said, I really feel like this Utah team has to play their brand of football in order to get a win in this one.
So know that it's not completely comparable, but after Caleb got hurt in the Pac-12 championship,
Yep.
and how he was mostly staying in the pocket,
Yep.
I feel like is comparable to Sean Clifford. He doesn't usually, unless he has to. That's where, in my opinion, he's better than CJ. If he has to, he will run.
Yeah.
But he tends to stay in the pocket. So, do you think that helps you guys get home, so to speak, and get to Sean? And do you think do you like the matchup between the defensive line and the offensive line and being able to get into the pocket?
I feel like it's going to be one of those back and forth ones. I don't think Utah is going to dominate the line of scrimmage. I don't feel like Penn State is going to be able to do whatever they want against Utah. I think both sides are going to have opportunities where they're going to find a way they're going to win. And as I mentioned, I just feel like whenever Utah can get Penn State in third long, that's where I feel like they might be at a little bit of an advantage, because you don't know what kind of blitzes and pressures they'll be throwing at. But I will say, I mean, Utah threw the kitchen sink at USC. So there a lot of what Utah will want to do, and they'll come up with some new stuff for the Penn State game, but a lot of some of their best stuff you see on tape against USC, so that Penn State can really watch that, study that, really prepare how to do it, because they've just been drilling it in these guys' minds for months, or not months, but excuse me, it feels like months with how long the break between this game is, honestly, but weeks and weeks and weeks, basically. So I feel like it's a very even matchup for both sides. I think early on the season, I think you would have looked at and said Penn State's going to absolutely dominate these guys, but with how especially Utah's defensive tackles, I feel like have taken a big step up. They're very strong in run support and get that interior pressure a little bit there too. And then you got strong defensive ends off the edge who are capable, who are better against the run than they are getting after the quarterback. Utah's top pass rusher, Jonah Ellis, I believe has a shot to play in this one. Last we checked, he'd missed a lot of the games for Utah on the season, which was a big loss, but they were able to overcome his loss, as we know, in the Pac-12 championship game. So I feel like it's going to be a lot of fun. I mean, there's so many great matchups in this game that's going to be a lot of fun to break down. One thing I do want to say, Buckeye Mike, did you say in that question you feel like Sean Clifford's better than CJ Stroud?
In the sense of, I did, but I mean in the sense of like taking off. I feel like for whatever reason, CJ just, and I understand the whole draft stock thing. It's just annoying. Like, you're here right now. Put your effort in now for the team. Put your body on the line for the team now.
Mm-hmm.
And, it looks better on tape if you do that, in my opinion. But I mean, passing wise, CJ wins that outright.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that Sean will run if he has to, I feel like makes him in that department better than CJ.
Yeah, and that facet of his game. Okay, I get what you're saying. I was just surprised. I'm like, you got Buckeye Mike talking about Sean Clifford. Like, dang.
But yeah, what are the strengths and weaknesses that people that don't know anything about Utah football but want to watch the Rose Bowl? What do they need to look out for?
Okay, so strengths for this Utah team, I would say it's interesting, right? Because usually I would go to like Dalton Kincaid, best tight end, Clark Phillips, best DB. They're not there. So it's a little different, I think, from what it started on earlier in the season. I think one of the strengths for this Utah team is Cam Rising. I mean, you look at the way he played in the Pac-12 championship game, you look at the way he played in last year's Rose Bowl, didn't get to finish that game because he was knocked out. He always seems to rise up in the biggest games overall. So I think he's going to be a big strength for Utah in this one. I think he's going to have a big game. And it's interesting because there's not dominant weapons on the outside. Hopefully Devon Vele plays. He was a little bit banged up in the Pac-12 championship game, so he was unable to go in that one. But I feel like in this one, so I think on the offensive side of the ball, it's Cam Rising. I think Utah's rushing attack has gotten stronger. I don't think I would be like Utah is one of the best rushing teams in the country. I feel like it's a good attack, and they got it going a little bit against USC, but it felt like the biggest reason they won that game was because of the big plays that Cam made in the past game. It was a complimentary win all around. They gave the MVP to Cam. It felt like everyone deserved the MVP in that game. Honestly, I thought it should have gone to the coaches because I thought it was a masterful game plan that they used. And yes, as we talked about, Caleb Williams' injury played a role in that. But either way, I think defensively for Utah, the big thing is the secondary still, even without Clark. I still feel like these guys are good. And it's an even matchup because, as we talked about, it's just crazy to think once again that both these teams are down their top pass catcher and top defensive back. So I feel like in that way, I still like what this Utah secondary is able to do. And yes, there's no Jordan Addison out there who Clark Phillips was guarding in the Pac-12 championship game. So there's still good receivers out there, and you have a good other corners out there capable of stepping up and locking it down. So I feel like the secondary, when you're talking about weaknesses a little bit of this Utah team, I think the offensive line for Utah has been very up and down all season. They were very good against USC for most of the game, doing a good job opening rushing lanes. But you look at a lot of their other games against big teams, they've struggled a little bit. So how much of that is improvements for this Utah offensive line? Have they gotten, are they the team we saw against USC, or was that just kind of a good day for them? Because through a lot of the year, they have struggled to be a dominant rushing attack. Compared to last year, they were a very dominant rushing team. And then you look also at Utah's, I said the defensive line, I feel pretty good about for Utah. I think they've gotten a lot better. There still could be some things there, but I just, with the way after they played in the Pac-12 championship game and the way they've been trending, I feel like they're going to do a good job. So for Utah, I would also say the linebackers are a little bit of the concern for Utah. Guys like Mahmoud Diabate is very good rushing the quarterback, but they playing him mostly as an off-ball linebacker this year, and he struggled in coverage at times. And especially with things like reverse or just any kind of run fakes, you can really get after Diabate because he's very over aggressive. So he puts himself out of position in a lot of ways. Corene Reed is a very good linebacker too, I would say, but every game there's always a couple tackles it seemed like he would miss. Once he had a great Pac-12 championship game. And Lander Barton's a true freshman. I mean, he's going to be an absolute monster. You talk about a four-star guy, a guy that Jim Harbaugh in high school flew out to Utah to watch him play in person, and Utah was able to keep him up. He's a very good freshman, but he's still a freshman. So I would say the two biggest weaknesses for this Utah team overall, on a team that, look, it's always hard to talk about weaknesses, right? When you're talking about a team that's in the Rose Bowl, I feel like the offensive line, they can be had a little bit where Utah could find themselves in those second and long situations because they're not going to run for 4 or 5 yards on first down a lot of the time, especially early on in the games. This Utah team has gotten off to a lot of slow starts this season. That's something they got to avoid versus the Nittany Lions in this one. And then defensively, as I mentioned, still linebackers, because there's been times this season where it's like, all right, it's on you. You got to make the play, got to make the tackle. And then they end up messing up and not making the play. So it's going to be a lot of fun to see how this one plays out and to see if Utah can shore up a couple of those weaknesses that really hampered them.
So with the whole James Franklin, a lot of guys give James Franklin a hard time because they say, like, if something goes wrong, he can't adjust. So do you feel like there's a chance that Kyle Whittingham can, like, expose that, especially at halftime if the game's close? Kyle Whittingham makes that one adjustment, and then the Utes can go on and win.
I think there's a chance they could. I mean, look, it's hard for me to be a guy who bashes James Franklin. I think he's a fantastic head coach. I think it's really hard whenever you're dealing with teams like Michigan and Ohio State year in and year out. And as we know, those are the only two losses the Nittany Lions suffered. And it's hard to avoid bad losses too. That's another thing that doesn't get talked about a lot in college football. Every single year, I remember I did a season preview earlier on with someone, and we were going through Oregon's schedule. And it was like, I just don't see the losses. And I'm like, yeah, but it's a first-year head coach. Like, it just seems like something's going to happen. And it did against their rival, Oregon State. So I feel like it's a big credit to James Franklin that he was able to avoid those inferior losses so many times, but just couldn't quite get over the hump. And like you said, part of that probably is because of those lack of adjustments there. So I do think between Morgan Scalley is one of the best defensive coordinators in the country. I think Andy Ludwig does a very good job as Utah's offensive coordinator. I think that could be something Utah could really get after. I especially, once again, just go to Morgan Scalley. I think he is a maestro when it comes to in-game adjustments and how to make things work. I mean, when Caleb got hurt, Utah was like, they smelled the blood in the water, basically. They were sharks. They started to attack and go after him. They felt that the time was right, and they went for it, and they really made those plays when it needed to with a masterful defensive game plan. And I thought offensively, whenever this team plays to win, I think they're very good. Sometimes when Utah gets up, they get a little conservative and like to run the ball, or even early on, sometimes they'll still be like super run heavy, and it's like, all right, come on, you got to air it out. Kyle Whittingham, of course, is still a defensive-minded guy. So I think Andy Ludwig, in part, also is someone who is tending to run the ball in moments, but I think this year he's done a better job being a little bit more explosive with this Utah offense. That was a big theme in fall camp for this Utah team, is they're going to be so much more explosive. And for most of the games, they haven't. They have been against the two USC games. It'll be interesting to see how that carries over in the Rose Bowl after they were so explosive against Ohio State last season. So it's going to be a lot of fun to see how this one plays out. And man, it's just, like we said, so many fun matchups, so many fun angles in this one. I can't wait for this Rose Bowl, guys. And it's only a couple weeks away, but dang it, I wish we were played it tomorrow.
So we know a lot of well, not a lot. We know some USC fans, and a lot of the verbiage going around with them after those losses to Utah was, especially the first one, was fluke, 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 and then
Well,
they
they
were
blame
trying.
the ref. They blame the refs.
Oh, they did.
They
Trust
blame
me.
the refs.
That is part of it, whether you blame the refs or not, which is still a bad cop out. But
Yes.
it was fluke, and then it went to Caleb Williams got hurt. If Caleb Williams wouldn't have got hurt, they wouldn't have even won the game. It wouldn't have been close. We were on our way to winning like 49-3, like Georgia did over Oregon. And I'm like, well, first of all, things didn't happen that way. Second of all, I understand your pain that you're upset about losing twice to the same team because it's hard to lose to the same team twice in the same year.
Especially
But
for a prideful fan base.
first of all, Utah has been the one to do it lately. You did it last year against Oregon, and now you did it against USC. And the other thing to me is like some of them were saying like, okay, we're getting ready to leave the conference to go to the Big Ten. We're leaving the conference in your hands, Utah. Don't screw it up. You got to be just as dominant as we've always been. And it's like, what do like you guys don't think that's the games were a fluke, right? I mean, obviously the Pac-12 championship game was not a fluke. You guys just outright dominated them. I think it would have been close. Maybe you guys lose, but it would have been close if Caleb didn't get hurt because eventually there's so much attack on the line that there's going to be those few times where the control of the line of scrimmage leans Utah's way, and you get home and you hit Caleb and you get pressure on Caleb to force mistakes. So I think it's crazy to me that like even I try to stay away from it as an Ohio State fan. I usually am pretty good about it. But it makes me uncomfortable. It makes me feel a little weird when it's like, oh, well, if it would have been full health, then we would have slaughtered them. Well, not necessarily. I mean, especially with the way that Utah's built, in my opinion, it would have been close.
And I didn't know Caleb Williams played defense either because, I mean, my goodness, the defensive performance we've seen both these games too has been atrocious from the Trojans for overall. I just think that's the part that drives. I can't tell you guys how much I hate blaming the refs. Yes, the refs can play. There can be bad calls. Things can happen. But at the end of the day, how many opportunities did the USC defense have an opportunity to get a stop on Utah, get them off the field? The same thing happened in the Pac-12 championship game. Teams have won Pac-12 championship games before holding a team under 14 points. So even with Caleb getting hurt, USC still could have had a chance to win that game, but their defense, I mean, the atrocious tackling. I think I saw stat was like the most missed tackles in a championship game in a very long time. So I mean,
third inning.
Yeah,
That play that went for a touchdown that burns in my head constantly.
Yes, exactly. So like I said, I can't stand. And also USC, like talk about being dominant. I mean, there's a reason Lincoln Riley's in his first year there because of the things that have happened these past couple of years. We know who the best program in the Pac-12 is historically, but I'm into the current history right now. In the past few seasons, Utah has been the best team in the Pac-12. As we know, they've been in 3 of the last 4 Pac-12 championship games. The lone exception to that being COVID. They haven't lost a true home game because they did lose a home game to USC in 2020. Hey, what's the whole reason home games are great? Fans. There weren't any of them there. Utah hasn't lost a true home game since 2018. So yeah, but going back to the question about this whole thing, I think it's absolutely ridiculous to call these games flukes and like that and just say like, oh, if Caleb didn't get hurt. Also, where the game really turned for me against Utah and USC, a lot of people talk about Clark Phillips' pass breakup on Jordan Addison, forcing the field goal instead of going up 21-3. It was 17-3, which is a big difference, obviously. So I think that's fair. But then after Jalen Dixon had caught a pass for Utah, he fumbled it. USC got it right back. They went 2 runs. They tried to throw it on 3rd down, and it was incomplete. They were on the 40-yard line. To me, USC should have gotten on the line, tried to get Utah to jump if they could, or if not, take a delay of game penalty, back it up a little bit, and punt it away because the Utah offense was coming off their first drive, which they went down, marched down, scored a field goal, but still stalled in the end zone. So you got that little bit of we stalled in the end zone, stalled in the red zone feeling at the end there late. But then you look at the next drive after that, 3 and out. The drive after that, a fumble. Utah offense didn't have any momentum. So USC then decides to go for it, give Utah a short field, and Utah just ran and took the momentum from there. And even USC fans like there could be like, oh, if we had just punted it, it would have been different. I mean, probably not with the way the rest of that game played out, because we saw Utah's offense be effective and mount those large drives after that too. So I just, like I said, I just think that's being a sore loser if your first instinct is to blame the refs. I think it's Jason Kelsey who had a great, I see the Eagles logo there too, so it fits perfectly. Jason Kelsey had a great rant about that recently when talking about that Eagles Washington football team, or Washington Commanders, still getting used to saying that game, where he was talking about how I hate blaming the refs only because there's so many things we did wrong as individuals. Accountability is such a big part of football. You got to look in the mirror and see what you did wrong first. And I think a lot of fan bases and people don't like to do that. So they want to blame the refs first, as that's the reason they lost the game. And yes, the refs can play a role in it. But if you look at, like I mentioned, once again, the first time USC and Utah played each other, USC's defense was on the field. Utah had to go 80 yards in, I got to say, they got the ball back with under 5 minutes or whatever it was. And Utah was able to do it. Why didn't USC's defense get them off the field? Because they weren't good enough to do so. They didn't make the plays when it mattered most. Why did USC's offense get limited in the second half? Because Utah made adjustments and really gave Caleb Williams in that offense a lot of fits. Then you look in the Pac-12 championship game, the job Utah did getting after them too. There's ways you can counteract a little bit of an injured quarterback. You're supposed to be able to try to run the ball a little bit. USC really wasn't able to do that. They weren't able to win those one-on-one matchups up front. They're the ones who missed tackles in the secondary. I mean, plays like Thomas Yasmin's long touchdown, if you guys know who that is, Utah's tight end. I mean, the backup tight end. I mean, two of the worst missed tackles I've seen on the season is the first ball he catches on the sideline. It's like the guy's right there, and then he just blows it. And I give Yasmin credit, of course, too, but more than anything, I just got to say, it's just terrible tackling. So I can't stand people who are going like, oh, it's a fluke, or I blame this, or I blame that. Because like I said, it's just such a cop-out to not take accountability. And there's so many things the Trojans should have done differently and could have done better to get wins in those games. And because they didn't, they now get to sit at home and watch the Utes go after the Rose Bowl.
So do you guys have any other questions for Jonathan before we get his final thoughts?
None.
So going into next season, like who do you guys think is going to be the quarterback? Do you think there's any chance that Cam comes back? Or
Yeah, so there's a slim chance Cam comes back. I would have said, well, Cam like told the media after his final home game against Stanford, I believe it was. He said, someone asked him, "Do you believe this is your last game in Rice-Eccles Stadium, where Utah plays?" And he said, "Yeah." So that where it seemed like the nail in the coffin. But then, when you're trying to get drafted, you don't want to have games like Cam had against Oregon, where that was one of the worst performances we've ever seen from him in a huge game. Now, thankfully for him, he had a great performance in the Pac-12 championship game. So it's like, okay, stock back up a little bit. But Cam Rising is now by no means a first-round quarterback. He's not even a day 2 guy. If he'd be lucky to be a day 3 guy, I feel like more than likely he's going to be undrafted. Look, maybe he has an unbelievable performance in the Rose Bowl, and that from that standpoint, he's able to find himself in the position he could be a 6th or 7th round draft pick. But I just don't see it right now. But it does feel like Cam's a guy who's been in college for a while now, been for a couple of years. So I do feel like he's looking at it like, I think he's ready to go to the NFL just based on the comments he's made and says. But here's the thing I'm looking at it from. What does his NFL future look like? He's mostly a backup guy. So he has the opportunity, if he wants to come back, to potentially help Utah three-peat, which would not just put him in, he's already in Utah immortality for winning two. I was honestly in there for winning the first. I mean, it's the first one ever. So he was pretty good there. Then went back to back. So it's like, man, one of the all-time greats. Could very well see his jersey retired or just something special for him in the future at Rice-Eccles Stadium. And then you look at if he came back again and had a chance to three-peat, that's college football immortality to me. So I definitely think there's a chance that he comes back. But to me, I just feels like he wants to go to the NFL. He's ready to be done with school, done with classes. He wants to go onto the league and just work on football. So if he does do that, Nate Johnson would be the guy for Utah I would look at. Their explosive freshman has been, I believe it was against Arizona, he came in and even his first, he was just a dynamic runner. They would put him in 2 red zone packages and he scored both times. He has electric speed off the edge. He hasn't thrown a ton this year, but I mean, he's a 4-star quarterback for a reason. We know he can throw the ball too. He's the guy that I would look at next year for Utah. And I don't think if Cam leaves, I don't think Utah would win a Pac-12 championship next year. I'll say, I just think that's such an important position. They could still have a chance to do so. There's a lot of talent on this team. I think Nate Johnson's really good, but it's very challenging to do so, as we know. So I think Nate Johnson would be the guy, and I think he'd be very good in his first year, but there would be a couple growing pains too. So it'll be interesting to watch and see how all that plays out. But yeah, I don't think Cam will come back. If he does, that would be awesome. Definitely a chance because of the world of college football we live in. But I feel like it's going to be Nate Johnson, who I personally and a lot of Utah fans are really excited about, because you could even just look him up and watch some of Nate Johnson's highlight plays, and you're like, whoa, guy's the fastest guy on the field. He's the quarterback, and he can sling it a little bit too. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And I think as soon as, like I said, next year, maybe not competing for a Pac-12 championship, maybe they are, maybe I'll be surprised. 2 years, I think they could definitely be right there with Nate Johnson in his third year and his second year as a starter.
So who do you think can be the breakout young player? Because with the opt-outs, it has a chance for the younger guys that haven't gotten that much playing time to shine in the big bowl game. So who do you think can really break out for the Utes?
It's hard because so many people. So I could say like Sione Vaki. He's done a really good job as the nickel corner, and I think could be playing it a lot in this one. But he's shined a little bit recently for Utah. Did a lot of good things in the Pac-12 championship game. And I think the other thing I look at too is, I know in some ways he already has broken out, right? Is Jaquindon Jackson. He's been in, there's a recent video that went viral of him too. But I just feel like that's the guy that could be in for a big performance in the Rose Bowl. I mentioned earlier, I don't know what kind of performance Utah is going to have rushing it in this one, but he's the kind of guy that if you're looking at a young guy where I'm like, okay, could they really pop off here? I think it could be Jaquindon. Makai Cope is another guy I would watch. He's a wide receiver for this Utah team. Didn't do a ton in the Pac-12 championship game, and look, Money Parks, Jalen Dixon, those have been the guys for this Utah team, but I really feel like Makai Cope is in for a big catch in this game. But I think Jaquindon Jackson would be the main guy. Former quarterback converted to a running back, made the switch this season after nearly winning the backup quarterback job. He's just an explosive athlete, a guy you want on the field, an electric runner, and just his progression from when he first started really playing running back. He made the switch not long after the Southern Utah game, I believe it was, to become basically a running back for this team. I think he's going to come back to this Utah team with a full offseason under his belt, really work at it. I think he's going to be one of the better running backs in the country next year because he is such a dynamic athlete. So I'd probably go Jaquindon as my main pick while staying with some of those guys I mentioned, like a Sione Vaki in there too. And I do think Lander Barton, even though he's only a freshman, so there's going to be up and downs, I think he's still going to make some nice plays in the Rose Bowl because he's just a gamer, and those guys usually do find ways to make things happen.
So, to close us out, why don't you give us a few minute-long breakdown for the game and your score prediction?
So I think it starts out like a shootout a little bit. I think I just think it'll be back and forth. I think early on we're going to see each team will punt on one of their first two drives and they'll score a touchdown their first two drives. So I really think we see that back and forth all game long, much similar to last year's game. I'll say I don't think it's as high scoring and I don't think it sets the record, but I do see this one going into the 30s, and I think it's going to be a close one in the 30s. I think Sean Clifford and Cam Rising both do good things. I could also see both of them making a mistake in this one, having a turnover that cost them a little bit too. So I do feel like we're in for another thrilling Rose Bowl. In the end, I think Utah's defense, the one extra turnover would be the difference. I think Utah will turn it over once. I think Penn State turns it over twice late, whether that's Sean Clifford or fumble, some kind of play the Utah defense is going to force. And I think Cam Rising is going to be able to close this one out late with some clutch plays. So I think Cam's going to have a chance to win the Rose Bowl MVP too. That'd probably be my pick. I just think he's in for another outstanding effort. And I think Utah gets a tight win. I'm going to go 38-32 in this one. The Utes are able to take it and win their first ever Rose Bowl.
Right. Sounds awesome, Jonathan. Well, from the Young Guns and all of us, we thank you very much for coming on today. We enjoyed having you. Just kind of let everybody know where they can find you. And I guess we can close it out from there.
Yeah, I'm available at Locked On Utes. Make sure you guys head over to Locked On Utes on YouTube. You can subscribe to our show. Just about at over 800 subscribers. Could be by the time this releases. Honestly, you can follow me on Twitter at JT Wistersill or follow our channel at Locked On Utes. So any of those areas, would love to interact with you guys on social or in the comments on YouTube. Guys, it's been a lot of fun joining you. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for coming.